Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Hello and welcome to this, the 50th, I'm told, edition of the Moggcast. I'm Henry Hill, the news editor at Conservative Home, and opposite me in his usual place is Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, there's a big story that we are going to have to touch on at some point, but I'm going to try at least to start on something else, and that is Marcus Rashford. Now, 2 weeks ago, when our editor asked you whether or not there was going to be a U-turn from the government on Marcus Rashford, you said, sometimes if you're following the right policy, you shouldn't be pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Now, in light of the rabbit that the government produced last week, do you think that means the government was following the wrong policy on free school meals?
No, I think the policy that has evolved is one of a much broader application to try and help children from most deprived backgrounds during holidays. And I actually supported an effort by Frank Field to do something about this about 2 years ago, long before I was in government, because I think it is genuinely important that there are children who do have additional needs, who during school time are very well looked after, but maybe less well looked after during holiday times. And this isn't free school meals, it's not the provision of welfare by the Department for Education. It is looking after disadvantaged children. And I think the problem with the discussion on free school meals is that it became a rather esoteric departmental issue as to who provides welfare. And in this country, it's not provided through our school system, it's provided through the Department of Work and Pensions, which is the right place to be providing welfare from.
Okay, now, so obviously during the debate, the MPs on all sides said that this was about, no one disagreed about feeding children. Why is it, do you think, that, one, it took so long to arrive at a response? Because when the government originally said that it wasn't simply going to be giving Mr. Rashford what he wanted, we all thought that there was going to be another policy. But instead there was quite a lot of delay during which the government, I think, expended quite a lot of political capital. Why do you think that was?
Well, first of all, I think giving people vouchers for free school meals would not have been the right answer. It was done as an immediate answer when schools weren't actually open. But I think a lot of people, when free school meals were talked about, thought that it was going to be the provision of a hot meal to children during the holidays. And that was never on the cards, and that wasn't what happened in the summer or indeed when the schools were closed. But in terms of why were there discussions about it, all policies are discussed. This is the natural process of government, that issues get raised, problems arise, MPs get letters from their constituents saying there is this difficulty, and then a policy has to be developed. There aren't sort of 100 policies sitting on the shelf just waiting to be wheeled out.
So just to clarify, what is the difference between the policy that the government has actually come up with and the policy that Labour or Mr. Rashford were asking for?
Oh, this is a much broader policy about helping children who need support during holiday times, rather than being simply a voucher for a free school meal. It's a completely different policy.
So it's not a voucher. How does it work?
Well, it's broader support. So it's about helping children get access to activities as well. It's a much bigger policy than a free school meals policy.
Does it contain a free school meals policy?
There is some support for food, yes.
Okay, right, fine, fair enough. So I suppose the last thing is, given that this has been presented as a U-turn, even though you say it isn't, I think much of the media coverage was quite unhelpful. When I looked at the debate, that the Opposition Day debate when the government, most of the MPs who spoke in defence of the government were members of the 29 INTIC. I think of the 7 that I quoted, 5 are of the 29 INTIC. Now, when you spoke to Paul about the forestry sell-off, you both spoke about how a generation of MPs had their fingers burned by going out, including yourself, defending the forestry sell-off and then suddenly finding out that actually it was not going ahead. Do you think that this new generation of MPs have similarly had their fingers burned by this experience, and do you think this will have implications for party management going forward?
Well, I hope not. I saw Paul writing about it, put me in the same category as the 2019 intake, because I defended it both to Conservative Home and indeed at Business Questions, and I feel that I defended in the right way something that has not in fact happened, that something else has happened. And because that something else meets part of the problem that was being raised, people have called it a U-turn. But I don't think that's actually accurate. Okay. But I also think there's far too much of an obsession with this U-turn issue, that sometimes decisions need to be changed, and they should be changed, and they shouldn't be stuck to purely out of stubbornness. As it happens, I don't think it is the case on this occasion. I think, as I was saying, it's a much broader policy that inevitably has taken a bit of time to develop, rather than a knee-jerk reaction to a short campaign.
Okay. So on the subject of change, I suppose we have to come to the big issue of the week, which is, do you know Dominic Cummings very well?
Not very well, no, but I've met him over the years and think extremely highly of him.
Well, so tell us, what do you think about? Do you think he's a very effective campaigner or policy wonk, or where do you think his strengths?
He's a formidably able man, but he is not a consensus operator.
Okay. So why do you think he has left the government now?
I think the advantages that Dominic brings are willingness to shake things up, and sometimes things get too shaken, and that is the problem. It's a bit like a martini, that it needs to be shaken to the perfect degree, but if too shaken, too much ice melts and it weakens its effect.
Okay, so what has been too shaken? Because as I understand it, Dominic came in with some very big ideas about things like civil service reform, procurement and so on. Now, because of the pandemic, those have not progressed as far as we might have expected after almost a year in office. So that obviously hasn't been shaken sufficiently. So what has been excessively shaken by Dominic Cummings that's precipitated this change?
The thing that he shook to the perfect level was obviously Brexit. It was an enormously successful policy which his drive and energy introduced. Civil service reform hasn't been forgotten about, but inevitably in the midst of a pandemic you can't carry out the reform. But you may think, because of the pandemic, that reform is more necessary than you thought it was before. You may think that the state could be stronger in certain areas and could have been more responsive in certain areas. And therefore, I think the argument for reform is probably stronger now than it was a year ago. I think it's more apparent to people operating within the system that, as we've heard quoted, some of the levers that seemed to be pulled didn't necessarily have the connection that you would have hoped for.
Surely, if it's more apparent than ever that change is needed, it's stranger that the stronger and one of the more able advocates of that reform is departing when he is.
Not necessarily. That ultimately you have to ensure that things are introduced that can be carried out effectively, and sometimes being too abrasive makes it harder to carry things out because opposition coalesces around that person in a way that is unhelpful to the overall objective.
All right. And speaking of opposition, do you know Carrie Symonds very well?
I don't know Carrie very well. I've met her a few times, and I think the briefing against her is disgraceful and disobliging.
So you don't think that in any sense Boris Johnson has replaced Dominic in some sense?
Ridiculous idea. She's formidably able, very capable person, but I think there's something. Well, I'm afraid I'm terrible at humbug. I'm embarrassed to say, when this was done to Mrs. Blair, I thought it was all perfectly fine because it was good political stuff.
Yes.
When it's done to Carrie, I think it's disgraceful. And having thought it through, actually it was disgraceful when it was done to Mrs. Blair. That inevitably senior politicians have spouses and partners, and those people get attacked when people are too cowardly to attack the principal.
But is it so unkind? I mean, as you say, I think it's inevitable that a political spouse will have some influence. As you say, Carrie has previously, before her relationship with the Prime Minister, she was an independent and very able operator at quite senior level in the Conservative Party. And it could be argued that some of the new policies the Prime Minister seems to be emphasising bear her fingerprints in terms of a greater emphasis on the green agenda. If, as you say, she is able and so on, why is it necessarily an unkindness to suggest that she has now got more influence in Downing Street than she did, say, a week ago?
Well, because of the way that it's written up, as if the Prime Minister is being manipulated. And it completely misunderstands the Prime Minister. And you say he's suddenly taken on this green agenda. That's not true. He's been following a green agenda for years. He was following a green agenda as Mayor of London. He wanted a garden bridge. He wanted Boris bikes, all sorts of green things that he was in favour of. and has pushed through as Prime Minister. And the COP that was meant to be happening this year, but is happening next year instead, is very much part of an agenda he was elected to government with. So I think people constantly make this mistake about the Prime Minister. They think that he will follow his advisors. Actually, the government is run by the Prime Minister. He makes the decisions, they are his policies. And people who don't like them should criticise him, not his fiancée. I think, frankly, I think it's ungentlemanly. And I'm surprised at Conservative Home, which I would always consider a most gentlemanly organisation.
Well, it's our duty to ask the questions, as I'm sure you're aware. Now, there has nonetheless been a change of the press, let's say the press, the other press, the rest of the press, the ungentlemanly press, has nonetheless spent the weekend suggesting that there's going to be a change in approach from the government, that it's going to be less adversarial, that it's going to adopt, as I said, a different policy emphasis, shall we say, rather than different policies on the green areas. Is that not true then? Is there not going to be a change? Is it the same as it was a week ago in terms of government emphasis and focus?
I think the issue around Dominic Cummings was his approach of putting policies forward. And there are always two ways of putting a policy forward. One is to advocate it diplomatically and bringing balm to Gilead. So I think the change will be there will be more balm in Gilead, because I think that Dominic Cummings wasn't a great one for balm, particularly.
Very well. And I'm just going to hop onto one of my hobby horses just for a second. The press reports about a softer approach to Scotland. Are they true, and what does that mean?
Well, what does softer mean is your correct question.
Yes.
And I have no idea what it's supposed to mean. What is fundamental is that we are one united kingdom. This is fundamental. We are the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Scotland is a key part of that. I think the pandemic has shown the strength of the United Kingdom. If you think £8.2 billion of UK taxpayers' money has been spent in Scotland, Scotland on its own would not have simply not have had the ability to find those sorts of resources. It's been a unionist effort for the whole country, with the unions, taxpayers helping each other. And so I think we have to make the argument for the union vigorously, but kindly. I think there was a mistake in the 2014 referendum, which I think we came close to losing rather than managing to win well, because the argument was basically, if the Scots don't stay with the UK, it'll be awful for them. I think it's a terrible message. I think we should say to the Scots, speaking of somebody who is English, thank you so much for being part of the United Kingdom. You are our valued friends and partners, and we need you. Not that we will be beastly to you if you have the temerity to go for independence. And I think if that's what you mean between hard and soft, then I'm all for soft. I'm all for recognising the value of the union rather than the Project Fear that was then tried again in the Brexit campaign, because I think that gets people's backs up.
So does the government's commitment to not granting a second referendum, even in the event that the SNP win a majority in next year's Scottish elections, is that still the case?
Well, I think we're just doing what the SNP asked for. They said it was a generational vote, and they now seem to think it should be the generation of a fruit fly. This is absurd. It needs to be a generation, and how long is a generation? It's not a specific length of time, but it's many, many years. It's not 6 years.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes for now. So on Brexit, we touched on Brexit very briefly when you said that Dominic Cummings has shaken Brexit to perfection and that it's a great success. Of course, Brexit's not quite over yet. We're currently in quite a crucial stage of the negotiations. Do you think, as a Brexiteer yourself, do other Brexiteers in the parliamentary party, does it make them nervous to see some key members of the Vote Leave operation who've been with the Prime Minister for some years now, leaving Downing Street weeks before the crunch comes with this next stage with the EU?
I mean, it's clear that the issues that led to Dominic Cummings' departure were not linked to Brexit. And I think that's really important. My Brexiteer friends have a reasonable degree of confidence in what's happening. I mean, the natural default position of Brexiteers is to be concerned. Of course it is, because since 1970 odd, they found that every time something's been agreed with Europe, it's turned out to be worse than expected. But I'm very, very confident this time that that won't be the case. Why? Because the Prime Minister is committed to Brexit. It is part of his political makeup. And again, to go back to what I was saying earlier, the Prime Minister has been consistent on this for a very long time, right back to his journalistic career. He has been willing to put his career on the line for a Eurosceptic view of the world on a number of occasions. And he is leading this government. It's not Dominic Cummings' government. It never was.
So, talking about things that Boris Johnson has been solid on, he ran for the Conservative leadership on a quite hard line against an Irish sea border and introducing any kind of, and that was at one point quite a sticking point for the entire Brexiteer caucus, if you like. Now, over the last few weeks, I don't know if you've been following it, it's been becoming more and more apparent that not only did that end up being, I will say, U-turned on, you might challenge that, not only did that end up being U-turned on, but the actual extent of the Irish sea border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is much larger than people supposed. We're now seeing that maybe supermarkets might have to cease operation in Northern Ireland, all kinds of things. Does that not make you nervous?
No, because of the UKIM bill.
Explain.
No, the UKIM bill has restored the sovereign power of the United Kingdom to make its own arrangements within the United Kingdom, if necessary. So you're absolutely right that there was an agreement on at-risk products.
Yeah.
And at-risk products are meant to be agreed at this joint committee. The default is that if nothing is agreed, then everything is deemed to be an at-risk product.
Yeah.
That would have been a ridiculous situation to be in and would have threatened the integrity of the United Kingdom. So the UKIM bill takes care of that. If the Joint Committee comes up with an absurd list of at-risk products or no list of at-risk products and therefore includes everything, we legislate it for it ourselves. We've taken back control. That's the key. So, yeah, this was my reason for supporting, and this really is ancient history. I doubt our devoted listeners will be particularly interested, but I'll mention it briefly. I supported Theresa May's third deal, the point at which she said she would stand down, because I thought, well, we can agree it, get out, we're then a sovereign nation, and then we'll have to change it. Okay. That if the EU thinks it can use the withdrawal agreement to place unreasonable obligations on us, then the UKIM bill is there as a fallback position. And that's really important. And it shows the determination of the Prime Minister to stick to what he said in the first place, which is my argument that he is somebody who is very focused and has a great sense of purpose. And he's not a twofold Boris. There's one Boris. Unum sanctum catholicam et apostolicam Borisam is how I put it.
Right. Well, let's quickly touch on the UKIM bill then, because obviously it hasn't passed yet. The House of Lords has sent it back. Now,
not yet, it hasn't. It's still got stages in the House of Lords.
Oh, it has.
It'll be finished in the Lords in early December.
Okay, but the indications are they're going to...
At committee stage, they've taken out Clause 5.
Yes, so what's the plan? Because as I understand it, given that we need to have this on the statute book by the time that by January the 1st, we don't have time to Parliament Act it or anything like that. So is the government going to have to back down? What's the plan? How are you going to... Because if the UKIM bill, I agree with you, the UKIM bill, I am perhaps in the middle of the Venn diagram of people whom the UKIM bill appeals to as a sort of sovereigntist Brexiteer. But how are we going to ensure that it is actually on the statute book in the proper form by the proper time?
It's a manifesto commitment.
Yep.
It was quite clear in the manifesto that there would be an internal markets bill. The Salisbury-Addison Convention applies. And I know the Salisbury-Addison Convention merely says that it won't be rejected on second reading, but actually that's always been held to mean that the basic thrust of the bill would not be overturned. Therefore, I would expect the House of Lords to follow the historic conventions.
And in the event that they don't?
Well, I assume the House of Lords will follow the historic conventions. Those are the indications that there are at the moment. Everyone knows the House of Lords doesn't like it. That's not news. But it would be very surprising if the House of Lords were to overturn the democratically elected House on a manifesto commitment within a year of a general election. I think few people understand our constitutional conventions to work in that way.
No, and indeed, although as we've learned to our horror over the last few years, those can change.
But that's very interesting. You're absolutely right. The conventions did change, but the House of Lords changed the application of the conventions when there was no majority in the House of Commons. And therefore, the Democratic House legitimised the alteration of the conventions.
Okay.
There is no prospect of an alteration of the conventions being legitimised in the elected House under these circumstances.
That's a very good point. So another question relating to Dominic Cummings and Brexit is that do you think that there is a realistic prospect of no deal? And if there is no deal, does it not make it an awful lot more difficult for the Prime Minister to sell it if, again, I know the reasons, as you say, are not related to Brexit, but does it not necessarily make the Prime Minister's task much more challenging to sell a no-deal Brexit to the nation if he has got rid of some of the core people who were the architects of this whole strategy?
I don't see why that follows. Do I think a no deal is still possible? Yes, of course I do. I have no inside information. I know no more than the well-informed reader of Conservative Home has as to what the likelihood is, and I follow the news stories as closely as anybody else. So it seems that a no deal, or an Australian-style deal, as we ought to call it, is still perfectly possible. But I think frankly, there's too much chatter about personnel changes in Downing Street. I'm rather with Harold Macmillan, who, when the whole Treasury team resigned, referred to a few little local difficulties. If losing your Treasury team is little local difficulties, losing a couple of advisors is not important in the grand scheme of things.
Although I suppose it's just it's a product of the media age that we live in, but nonetheless, one might think that it's a sign, even if we wish it wasn't the case. You know, the famous Enoch Powell quote about complaining about the sea. One might wish that the media didn't focus.
I'm not beginning to complain. And Lord Thornycroft's resignation, in whenever it was, 1959, was widely reported at the time, along with Enoch Powell and somebody else who I won't remember, but can't. And, you know, the government had a majority of 100 and it steamed on. It was years before it faced any serious problems. And Macmillan was right, little local difficulties. These are little local difficulties. They won't affect how the country is governed next year. And Margaret Thatcher's point, which we've heard many, many times about advisors advising and ministers deciding, the man in charge is one B. Johnson. And he has the support of the country, he has the support of the Conservative Party, has the support of the Cabinet. That's what constitutionally he needs. And his advisors, well, advisors come and go.
Fair enough. Now, I'm going to, again, having seized the chair, leap onto one of my hobby horses quickly, which is the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. The government has said not said much about this. Quite understandably, it's not necessarily a high priority commitment in light of other things. But we hear lots of people are still talking about the next election as if it's definitely going to be in 2024, as if we still have this timetable. So, is the government still going to press ahead with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act? And two, how is it going to do it? Because as I understand it, there are two different ways that you could go about going back to something resembling the status quo ante. You could either simply legislate in statute to give the Prime Minister discretionary power to dissolve Parliament on a new statutory footing, or you could try and do it in such a way that you repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, you reinstate certain other pieces of legislation, and you try and go back to the prerogative, or something close to the prerogative. Which do you think the government will choose, and which, as a constitutionalist yourself, would you have it choose?
I fear it's a hobby horse we both share. I think changing the FTPA is of fundamental importance, and we saw last year the very damaging effects it had to the government of this country, and it was a stupid piece of legislation. Why? Because it misunderstood how the British Constitution works. It misunderstood the fundamental point that the government has to command a majority in the House of Commons, and if it doesn't, it must go back to the electorate. It must refer to its boss and find out what the boss thinks. And so the FTPA was a constitutional excretion, and I'm very glad that it is going to go. It is still government policy to get rid of it. Evelyn Moore complained that the Tories in his lifetime had always been accused of wanting to turn the clock back and had never managed to turn it back by 10 minutes. I'm hoping that we can turn the clock back and restore the status quo ante. I think that's the obvious thing to do, and to restore the prerogative. And
you think that will be constitutionally possible?
Oh, yeah, yes, I think it's absolutely constitutionally possible. The prerogative, once taken, is then subject to statute. But I've never seen why that doesn't then mean that the statute can be used to restore the prerogative, because the statute can do anything. There's no limit on the statute. So you don't need to keep a a legal framework based on the FTPA, you can go back to the prerogative. And it's quite important because dissolution is quite clearly a proceeding in Parliament. Therefore, it's covered by Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. Therefore, you can't have the Prime Minister advising the Queen to go to the country and have a legal case taking up 4 of the 5 weeks of the election campaign with nobody knowing whether there'd be an election on the following Thursday or not, which would not be a sensible way of organising things.
Well, are we so confident in the shield of Article 9 in light of Miller 2 and the Supreme Court judgment against the prorogation?
I think the idea that dissolving Parliament is not a proceeding in Parliament, it would be a very eccentric view.
Well, yes, okay, fair enough. In which case, I think that probably brings us to about 25 minutes. So I could probably speak to you for another 25 minutes about the Fixed Term Parliaments Act on its own, but I suspect we would probably test the patience of our listeners.
Well, perhaps we should devote a Moggcast to the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
I would be delighted.
In due course. It would certainly suit me.
If you're one of the 5 listeners who would be desperately keen for such a privilege, please let us know in the comments under the article, and we'll see if we can make that happen. Jacob, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. It's always a pleasure. And
my pleasure.
I'm sure there'll be another look. Whoever has the privilege of speaking to you in 2 weeks' time, there'll be plenty more to discuss.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.